In 1971, a single decision made in a room far away from the American public quietly changed the value of every dollar you'll ever earn. No vote, no headline that most people understood at the time, just a signature. And from that moment forward, the money in your wallet stopped being backed by anything except trust. Fast forward to today, and central banks around the world are buying gold at a pace not seen in generations. Not silver, not stocks, not cryptocurrency. Gold, the very asset that some people still call outdated, is being quietly stockpiled by the same institutions that print and control the money you use every single day. So here's the question you need to ask yourself before you watch anything else on this channel today. If the world's most powerful financial institutions are buying gold like their future depends on it, what exactly do they know that you don't? This video is not about hype. It's not about fear-mongering, and it's not about telling you to panic and empty your bank account. This is about understanding a pattern that is repeated throughout history, again and again, almost like clockwork, and recognizing where we might be standing on that timeline right now in 2026. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why gold has survived every currency collapse, every war, every recession, and every financial crisis in recorded history. You're going to understand what the Federal Reserve's decisions actually mean for your savings account. And you're going to understand why so many everyday Americans who ignored gold in the past ended up regretting it, sometimes for decades. Let's start at the beginning. To understand why gold matters today, you have to understand what money actually used to be. For most of modern history, paper currency wasn't valuable on its own. It was a receipt, a promise. If you held a dollar bill before 1971, that piece of paper represented a fixed amount of gold sitting in a vault somewhere. The system was called the gold standard, and it existed because governments understood something important. Paper is easy to print, trust is not. Gold gave the dollar a foundation that couldn't be manipulated by a printing press. Then, in August of 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer allow other countries to exchange their dollars for gold. This is often referred to as the Nixon shock. It was framed at the time as a temporary measure. It was never reversed. From that point forward, the dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, meaning its value is based purely on government decree and public confidence, not on any physical asset backing it. Now here's why this matters to you personally. Once that link to gold was severed, something changed permanently in how money worked. Governments gained the ability to create more currency whenever they wanted, without being limited by how much gold they physically had. And history shows us, over and over again, what tends to happen when that power is used aggressively. We're going to get into exactly what happened next, but first, you need to understand a simple truth that most people never stop to consider. Here's something most people don't think about until it's too late. Inflation isn't just prices going up, it's your money going down. Every dollar you hold today buys less than it did 10 years ago, and unless you understand why, you'll keep assuming that rising prices are just normal. Since the end of the gold standard, the US dollar has lost a significant portion of its purchasing power. This isn't opinion, it's documented economic history. A dollar in 1971 could buy far more goods and services than a dollar can buy today. Groceries, housing, healthcare, education, all of it has climbed steadily, while wages for many Americans have struggled to keep pace. This is where gold enters the picture, historically speaking. Gold has never been able to be printed. No central bank, no government, no committee can simply create more of it out of thin air. There's a finite amount of it on Earth, and mining new supply is slow, expensive, and limited. That scarcity is exactly why, throughout thousands of years of human civilization, gold has consistently held value even when currencies around it collapsed. Think about that contrast for a second. Paper money is a promise that can be broken. Gold is a physical asset that has held meaning across every culture, every century, and every economic system in recorded history, from ancient Egypt to the Roman Empire to modern-day central banks. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern worth paying attention to. But understanding inflation is only half the story. To really see why 2026 might be a turning point, we need to talk about what the most powerful financial institution in the world, the Federal Reserve, actually does behind the scenes. The Federal Reserve has one of the hardest jobs in the world, whether you love them or criticize them. Their job is essentially to control two things that often pull in opposite directions: inflation and economic growth. When the economy slows down, the Fed tends to lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and spending. When inflation rises too fast, they raise interest rates to cool things down. Here's the problem. Every time the Fed lowers interest rates, it becomes cheaper to borrow money, which usually means more money flows into the economy. More money in circulation, without a matching increase in goods and services, tends to push prices higher over time. This is basic supply and demand applied to currency itself. Now, over the past several years, we've watched the Fed navigate one of the most complicated economic environments in modern history, raising rates aggressively to fight inflation. then facing pressure to eventually bring rates back down to support growth and reduce borrowing costs for the government itself. And that last part is important because the U.S. government's own debt load has grown to levels that require enormous amounts of interest payments every single year. This creates what many economists describe as a difficult long-term tension. Higher rates fight inflation, but make government debt more expensive to service. Lower rates ease that debt burden, but risk reigniting inflation. It's a balancing act with no perfect solution. And historically, periods of high government debt combined with pressure to keep rates lower have often coincided with rising interest in gold as a hedge. This is exactly the environment we find ourselves discussing in 2026. And it's exactly why central banks themselves have been making a very specific move that deserves your full attention. Here's something that should make you pause. Central banks, the very institutions that manage currencies for entire nations, have been net buyers of gold at some of the highest levels recorded in decades. Countries like China, Russia, India, Turkey, and Poland have significantly increased their gold reserves in recent years. Why does this matter? Because central banks aren't emotional investors chasing a trend on social media. They are long-term, strategic institutions making decisions based on decades of economic modeling and geopolitical planning. When these institutions collectively shift toward accumulating more gold, it's worth asking why. Part of the answer lies in something called de-dollarization, a trend where certain countries are actively trying to reduce their dependence on the US dollar for international trade and reserves. This is partly geopolitical, especially following sanctions imposed on countries like Russia, which demonstrated to other nations that dollar-based assets can be frozen or restricted under certain political circumstances. Gold, on the other hand, is a physical asset that sits in a vault, doesn't require another country's cooperation to access, and can't be frozen by a foreign government's decision. To be clear, this is analysis based on observable trends, not a guaranteed prediction of what will happen next. Nobody can know for certain how global currency dynamics will unfold, but the pattern of central bank buying is a documented fact, and it tells us that some of the most sophisticated financial minds in the world are positioning themselves defensively, treating gold not as a relic of the past, but as a strategic asset for an uncertain future. Now, you might be thinking, that's central banks? What does that have to do with me? That's exactly what we're going to answer next, because history has shown a very specific pattern of what happens to everyday people who pay attention to these signals versus those who don't. Let's talk about the 1970s for a moment, because this decade offers one of the clearest historical case studies for understanding gold's role during periods of high inflation. After the U.S. left the gold standard in 1971, the country experienced a period of significant inflation throughout the decade, driven by a combination of oil price shocks, expansive monetary policy, and other economic pressures. During this period, the price of gold rose dramatically, moving from around $35 an ounce, where it had been fixed, to several $100s an ounce by the end of the decade. People who held cash and traditional savings during that period watched their purchasing power erode significantly, even though the number in their bank account stayed the same or grew slightly through modest interest rates. Meanwhile, those who had allocated a portion of their wealth into gold saw that portion of their portfolio act as a meaningful hedge against the inflation eating away at everything else. This is not to say gold always outperforms every other asset, because it doesn't. And there have been long stretches of time where gold underperformed stocks, real estate, and other investments. That would be an oversimplified and misleading claim. Gold is not a magic solution, and past performance never guarantees future results. But what history does show consistently is that during periods of high inflation, currency instability, or major loss of confidence in financial institutions, gold has historically served as one of the more reliable stores of value compared to holding cash alone. We saw a similar pattern play out again during the 2008 financial crisis. As banks collapsed, markets crashed, and the Federal Reserve responded with unprecedented monetary intervention, gold prices climbed significantly in the years that followed, as investors sought safety outside the traditional banking system. The pattern isn't perfect, and it isn't instant, but it's consistent enough across enough different decades and different economic crises that it deserves serious consideration rather than dismissal. So the real question becomes, what makes 2026 potentially different, and why are so many analysts drawing comparisons to these previous turning points? As of 2026, several economic conditions are converging in a way that echoes previous periods of gold strength, though it's important to state clearly that this is analysis and forecasting, not a guaranteed outcome. Government debt levels in the United States remain historically elevated. The Federal Reserve continues to navigate the difficult balance between controlling inflation and supporting economic growth. Geopolitical tensions in multiple regions of the world continue to create uncertainty around global trade and currency stability, and central bank gold buying, as we discussed, remains at historically strong levels. Financial analysts across different institutions have offered varying forecasts about where gold prices could head, and it's worth being honest with you here. These are predictions, not certainties. Nobody, no analyst, no economist, no YouTube channel can tell you with certainty what will happen to any asset's price in the future. Anyone who claims otherwise is not being straight with you. What can be said with more confidence is this: the underlying conditions that have historically driven investors toward gold, high government debt, inflation concerns, currency uncertainty, and geopolitical instability are all present simultaneously right now in a way that mirrors previous historical turning points. That convergence is why so many financial commentators are treating 2026 as a period worth paying close attention to. This doesn't mean you should make any hasty decisions based on a YouTube video. It means the information deserves your genuine consideration, and it means understanding the historical pattern before deciding for yourself how you want to think about your own financial future. Here's the most important thing to understand before we wrap up. Gold isn't about getting rich quickly. It's not a lottery ticket, and anyone presenting it that way is being misleading. Throughout history, gold has functioned primarily as a form of insurance, a way to preserve wealth during periods when traditional currency and financial systems come under stress. The people who have historically regretted ignoring gold weren't people who expected to strike it rich. They were people who woke up one day, during a period of high inflation or financial crisis, and realized that the purchasing power of their savings had quietly eroded while they weren't paying attention. They regretted not having some portion of their wealth protected against that erosion, not because gold made them wealthy, but because it would have helped preserve what they already had. This is the mindset shift that matters. Gold isn't about speculation. It's about balance, about not having all of your financial security tied to a single system that has, throughout history, demonstrated real vulnerabilities during specific periods of stress. Let's bring this all together. The dollar hasn't been backed by gold since 1971, which gave governments the ability to expand the money supply in ways that have historically led to inflation and a gradual loss of purchasing power. The Federal Reserve faces an ongoing balancing act between controlling inflation and managing enormous government debt, a tension with no easy resolution. Central banks around the world have been accumulating gold at historically significant levels, a pattern that reflects strategic, long-term thinking from some of the most sophisticated financial institutions on Earth. And history, from the 1970s and to 2008, has repeatedly shown that gold tends to perform as a valuable hedge during periods of high inflation and financial instability, though it is never guaranteed and should never be treated as a certainty. None of this is financial advice, and this video isn't telling you what to do with your money. What it's telling you is this: the pattern has repeated throughout history, again and again, and the people who understood it early were the ones who had options when everyone else was left playing catch-up. The people who ignored it were the ones left wondering, years later, why they didn't pay closer attention when the signs were right in front of them. The choice of what to do with that information is entirely yours. But now at least, you're making that choice with your eyes open. If this video helped connect the dots for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to understand this information before it's too late to act on it. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of these economic shifts instead of reacting to them after the fact. And I'd love to know, down in the comments, do you think gold still has a place in a modern investment portfolio? Or do you think its time has passed? Let's talk about it. I'll see you in the next one.